I'm Katie Zay. I'm the CEO of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, or RCRC as we fondly call it. And we are honored to be hosting today's conversation as part of our winter series of webinars for RCRC's Religion and Repro Learning Center. The Learning Center is our online venue for education, analysis, strategy development, and interdisciplinary resources to equip religious leaders, scholars, and social activists in support of reproductive freedom. We bring into conversation leading experts in religion, justice movements, and a cross-section of academic disciplines, including history, law, ethics, and medicine. We will put a link in the chat for the Religion and Repro Learning Center website, where you can access for free our self-paced courses on topics like fetal life and personhood and reproductive racism, as well as look through our extensive resource library. I'm going to make a few announcements before I introduce today's moderator. On February 17th at 4 p.m., we will be hosting a virtual launch event for my new book, A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement. This is an abortion storytelling book that explores the personal and systemic nuance of abortion and calls on people of faith to engage in sacred listening and compassionate response. We have a really exciting program with several special guests that we'll be announcing soon, and I hope you will join us for that celebration and conversation. We will also put a link in the chat to register for that. And on February 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we will host the next webinar in our series. This one is entitled Massacre Generation, which will feature student leaders from our Spiritual Youth for Reproductive Freedom program, or SURF. The lives of millennials and Gen Zers and their parents have been shaped by mass shootings, threats of deportation of immigrant parents, and the avalanche of legislative reproductive injustices. So we'll hope you join us as we explore the intersectional impacts on the reproductive dignity and human flourishing of today's young generation. Again, we will put a link in the chat about our SURF program, and we will be following up with how to register for this important webinar in the coming weeks. A few more logistics, and then we will get to today's moderator. If you're logging in today and you would like to, we invite you to share in the chat box where you're logging in from, and if you're part of an organization, however you want to be identified, and we invite you to be in conversation with each other there. In addition, we specifically have a Q&A box where you can put any questions that you have for the panelists. We'll have about 10 minutes toward the end of our time together to engage your questions. So please do use that throughout today's conversation. You can also use the upvote feature to like any questions that you would prefer our panelists to answer. So be on the lookout for that. Okay, and now I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today, the chair of the RCRC board and my good friend, Bishop John Selders. Bishop Selders is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and is the organizing pastor of Amistad United Church. Oh, I used to be United Methodist. That was a Freudian slip. Sorry. Amistad United Church of Christ in Hartford, Connecticut. Bishop Selders is Assistant Dean of Students and Coordinator of Community Standards at Trinity College in Hartford and a founding member of Moral Monday, Connecticut. He is Bishop Presider of the Interdenominational Conference of Liberation Congregations and Ministries and the co-convening bishop of the Sacred College of Progressive Episcopates. Reverend Selders has served as adjunct faculty at Yale Divinity School, where he and I met, Andover Newton Theological School, Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry, and the Seminary Consortium for Urban Pastoral Education, to name a few. He also serves, as I said, as board chair of RCRC, in addition to his extensive spiritual activism, social justice, and academic work. Bishop Selders is an award-winning songwriter, musician. Welcome, Bishop Selders.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everybody. I am glad to be here. Glad to be a part of such an interesting and timely conversation, and welcome you all to participate. And RCRC has been, in part at the center of much of what I've been doing in a national context over the last decade plus these days. And so it's been very dear and near to my heart. And so I'm glad to be a part and to participate in this conversation. and in this series that takes a look at how we as folk who are, I would say, publicly religious, and how we engage in social issues, and of course, in particular, health rights and justice when it comes to the idea of choice. And so I am pleased to welcome these panelists. Can I introduce them to you? And let me just remind you once again, you'll have an opportunity to engage them. I'm going to, in fact, ask you if you have questions or you want to make comment, please do that via the chat and the Q&A. Let's get started. Let me introduce these individuals who will be addressing us and talking to us and sharing from their wealth of experience and knowledge. Let me start with Sister Rachel. I'm gonna do my best. Rachel Tabachnick. Did I get it right? Ish. All right. She is an independent researcher, formerly PRA Associate Fellow, and a longtime contributor to Talk to Action, the website which monitors the religious right. She did that work primarily between 2005 and 2017. Rachel's focus is on the impact of the religious right on policies and politics, domestic and foreign, and its intersection with other sectors of conservative infrastructure, including the free market think tanks. Rachel has been interviewed on NPR and other radio and print media across the nation on topics including the New Apostolic Reformation, Christian Zionist, and educational privatization. Her research is referenced in numerous books, dissertations, and nonprofit reports. Thank you for being here, Rachel. Let me also introduce Fred Clarkson. He has written about politics and religion for more than 3 decades, and his work has appeared in a wide range of publications from Mother Jones to Church and State and Ms. Magazine to the Christian Science Monitor, Salem.com, Salon.com, not Salem, that was a Freudian slip there, Salon.com, and the Religion Dispatches. He has worked as an investigative editor at Planned Parenthood Federation of America, as a communications director at the Institute of Democracy Studies, and co-founded the group blog Talk to Action. He is the author, co-author, or editor of several books, including Dispatches from the Religious Left, The Future of Faith and Policy in America, and Internal Hostility, the struggle between theocracy and democracy. Thank you, Fred, for being here with us. Let me also introduce Katherine Stewart. She is an author, and this new book is off the chain. I just told her it's some fire. It's some fire. The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. She writes about politics, policy, religion, and education for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and the New Republic, among others. The Power Worshippers was an award. It was awarded the first place in the Excellence in Nonfiction Religion Books category by the Religion News Association. Her previous work, the Good News Club, was an investigation of the religious right and public education. And finally, the Reverend Dr. Traci Blackmon, who is the Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ. As a featured voice on many local, national, and international platforms, Reverend Blackmon's work and her life's work focuses on the communal resistance to systemic injustice through the redemptive power of love. Her leadership in the community response to the police-involved killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson gained broad national and international recognition from the White House to the Vatican. Reverend Blackmon is the recipient of the NAACP Rosa Parks Award, inductee to the Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Preachers, Ebony Magazine's Power 100 in 2015, the St. Louis American's Citizen of the Year award in 2017, and named as one of the 15 faith leaders to watch in 2020 by the Center for American Progress. She has an honorary doctorate from Eden Theological Seminary and is National Planned Parenthood Faith Leader Award. This is my sister. She's from the Lou. I'm from the Lou. Reverend Dr. Traci Blackmon, thank you for being here. If we were in a house, I would say, can we get a wonderful round of applause and amen to these panelists? But since we're here virtually, you got to do it virtual. All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Rachel, let's start with you. Okay. Today, we are experiencing a degree of social polarization that's unprecedented, I believe, certainly in modern times. What role has conservative think tanks, I think you might say a lot, but anyway, conservative think tanks play in shaping and capitalizing on this polarization? And if you could then further talk about how they have developed theological frameworks to undergird these conservative ideologies and about these key wedge issues, these inflection points where they insert themselves in. And lastly, if you could address a bit, what's the ultimate goal for these groups from the conservative right?
Thank you, Bishop Selders. So conservative infrastructure, polarizing, yes. There's a lot of emphasis right now on the role of social media and the internet, and rightly so. But before there was social media, before we had smartphones and personal computers, all of us, conservative infrastructure was already dramatically changing how politics works and how Americans get information. You know, you have probably all seen these complex diagrams of the Koch brothers' money or donors' trust, and this is helpful, but it doesn't tell us much about how that money translates into moving ideas from the margins to the mainstream, or how it takes on this theological framing that we're talking about. Slide 2. So I'm showing you an article that I've used over and over and over again, and will continue to do so by our next speaker, Frederick Clarkson. And the reason I do so is that Fred, in this article, captured a moment in time 23 years ago, when this infrastructure had already been under works for like more than a quarter of a century, but it was not being taken very seriously. And I would argue it still is not taken seriously enough today. What was so important about this article was that he focused on the development of infrastructure at the state level of what were called free market think tanks, something like a little mini heritage foundation in every state and linked together at the national level. But Fred also focused on the development of state level religious think tanks or organizations, family policy councils, also networked at the national level. Next slide. So we've got two parallel tracks here, okay? Creating a path to market their ideas directly to Americans, changing who the elite policymakers would be and how that policy would be determined. And of course, they did this, the free market think tanks, by bypassing academia and traditional political institutions, and with the family policy councils, bypassing churches, pastors, denominational structures, and taking this directly to the public and directly to grassroots and the grass tops. So these parallel tracks, the free market think tanks and the family policy councils, often coordinated along the way on policy, but they also came to merge. And I want to sort of explain how that has happened. Next slide. I've used an example, also an old example, but it's one that really addresses question 1 and 2 and sort of how this takes place. And it's an ongoing example that is really on an issue that is central to polarization in this country. The example is the Cornwall Alliance that was initiated to counter efforts of pro-environmental advocacy in churches. I'm also using this example because it played a significant role in incorporating some specific anti-abortion memes. So Cornwall has played a major role in redefining what Judeo-Christian or biblical stewardship is, marginalizing other religious leaders who disagree with them, discrediting accepted science, and ultimately impacting policy, including providing expert testimony for legislation. Next slide. Some of you may remember back in the many years ago, 2008, it seems like, when Al Sharpton and Pat Robertson were in an internet advertisement about the need to protect the earth. It's hard to imagine. The text goes something like, the talk goes something like this: we're polar opposites, we strongly disagree, except for one issue, and that would be our planet. We all need to work together, get involved. And Pat Robertson says, it's the right thing to do. So what happened to this unity? And this is what I want to explain to you briefly, is how this counter movement took place, encompassing much of conservative infrastructure and how it was put in a theological framework. Next slide. In 1997, Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty published a book that laid the foundation for a religion-based, let's say, anti-environmental movement, I would call it. The author, Calvin Beisner, continues to lead this project to today, which is called the Cornwall Alliance. So 2 years after this book, in 1999, Acton brought together a group of like-minded theologians, economists, scientists to meet in Cornwall, Connecticut, followed in 2000 by a declaration signed by Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, and Jewish leaders. Then in 2005, this group was transformed, this interfaith network group was transformed into the Cornwall Alliance, and this was announced at a lunch at one of the US Senate buildings hosted by Acton Institute and the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Next slide. So within a couple of years after that ad that I showed you with Al Sharpton and Pat Robertson, the Cornwall Alliance began the launch of an extensive media project, including this book, Resisting the Green Dragon, Dominion, Not Death. The author describes environmentalism as a religion with sacraments of sex, abortion, and sterilization. He adds that this movement is tracking the rising clout of modern feminism. Next slide. The Cornwall Alliance also developed this accompanying multiple DVD set featuring 12 half-hour sessions used for training at churches, Sunday schools, classrooms, and so forth. There were leading religious right figures introducing the theme of the Green Dragon as a religion in conflict with Christianity, a religion of elites attacking the poor of the world. In addition to these religious right leaders, there were a number of significant think tank figures. Let me point out a few. Next slide. This includes, on the left, Calvin Beisner, who headed up the project. Let me just point out Stephen Hayward, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and treasurer of the infamous Donors Capital Fund associated with Donors Trust. Next slide. Also included the former vice president of the Heritage Foundation, Becky Norton Dunlap, Michael Ferris, president of the Homeschool Legal Defense Fund, founder of Patrick Henry College, and part of the Trump administration's 1776 Committee for Patriotic Education. Then next, James Tonkowich of IRD. And also, you probably will recognize Charmaine Yost, former president of Americans United for Life, who led a session titled The Green Face of the Pro-Death Agenda. And then last, on your right, David Ligoti's prominent climate change denier, who later joined the Trump administration as head of the US Global Change Research Program. So after a few years of this campaign, and other assaults also, but this campaign, Pat Robertson and many others had dramatically changed their tune. Next slide. Acton Institute, which launched this long-term campaign, is a hub in national and international efforts to impact economic policy positions of religious leaders in numerous denominations. Much of their work directed specifically toward Catholic leaders, and they have a satellite office a few blocks from the Vatican. Acton's major donors include the DeVos and Prince families, and Betsy DeVos was a treasurer for many years. Now, hopefully, this brief illustration answers some of the questions about 1 and 2, the first and second questions about capitalizing on polarization, as well as the theological framework for doing so. Before going on to the last question about the end goal, I want to reference the previous seminar in October for those who did not participate and say a few words why I think this topic is important. The seminar was on Dominionism, the focus primarily on Christian Reconstructionism, the source of modern day Dominion theology, which is a plan for reconstructing America under biblical or Mosaic law, and how these ideas have spread through the larger religious right. Next slide. In the previous webinar, I referenced blueprints of the movement's founders and leaders, including Rousas Rushdoony and Gary North. And media, much of it from the 1980s, that provided theological underpinnings for a reconstructed America in areas including the list on the next slide. Thank you. So, as you see here, the blueprint looked at money, welfare, family, economics, government, and what a reconstructed America would look like. Next slide. So this media also provided the theological underpinnings for many of the things that seem to be emerging from nowhere in recent years, despite the fact this media is from the 1980s. This includes theological underpinnings for militias, unregulated gun ownership, militant anti-abortion activism, the lesser magistrate doctrine that we're seeing out there everywhere now for defying federal law, nullification, and many more things. Next slide. Going back to Acton Institute for a minute, let me be clear, Acton and its leadership do not self-identify as supporting Dominionism. And in fact, they pushed back when religious historian Randall Balmer described the Institute as an example of merging of corporate interest with advocates of Dominion theology. However, Acton is also a good example of the cross-pollination that's going on with Christian Reconstructionism and its ideas. For example, Acton has sponsored Christian Reconstructionist events featuring some of the most prominent leaders like Gary North and Gary DeMar, featured Reconstructionist writers, and Calvin Beisner, the head of the Cornwall Alliance Project, played a significant role in a 1980s initiative called the Coalition on Revival that brought Christian Reconstructionists together with conservative religious leaders from various denominations and differing eschatologies. Next slide. So this initiative included a gathering on the Mall in DC in front of the Lincoln Memorial on July 4th, 1986, and signing of this Christian manifesto. And as you can see, the assistant editor was Calvin Beisner down at the bottom of the page. Next slide. The initiative also resulted in a series of worldview documents in many different areas, laying out a vision and action plan for government, economics, education, business, arts, medicine, and so forth. And Beisner was the assistant editor on all of these documents, as well as the chairman of the worldview document on economics. Next slide. So this is not about who is a Reconstructionist and who isn't, and who was a Reconstructionist and isn't any longer, but I think for our purposes, it's about how these ideas spread and how are they spreading into the mainstream. The green dragon that I showed you, and this is some clips from the shots from the film, is one of the many examples how theological framework has been built, bridging right-wing libertarianism or paleo-libertarianism and religion, and then disseminating those ideas across the country in a form that can be easily understood, digested, and shared. These campaigns are filled with imagery, memes, narrative, new terminology that's been co-opted from other things, that then makes its way out into the echo chambers of conservative media. And if you have never seen Resisting the Green Dragon, you can look at a trailer online, just pull it up and look at a trailer to see the kind of imagery that I'm talking about. Next slide. It's easy to be dismissive of an obscure movement that's openly theocratic. And if we look at dominionism through sort of the single lens of a single issue, it's hard to believe, say, for example, that there are that many Americans who want to stone people in the streets for being gay or having an abortion. But we need to understand that Americans are being made into the enemy and even portrayed as demonic. And religious beliefs that don't align with theirs are being discredited as part of some kind of sinister conspiracy. Studying and analyzing Dominionism, Christian Reconstructionism, and the adaptation of Dominionism seen, for example, in the New Apostolic Reformation, it is not the only question or answer to understanding how we got here, but we need a broader and deeper understanding of conservative infrastructure and how it interconnects with the religious right. Next slide. It's important to look at Christian Reconstructionism as a whole that is greater than the sum of all its parts. In other words, not just from a single issue perspective, but how has it played a role in changing theology and bringing the religious right into politics? The role in homeschooling and curriculum, the role in defining what biblical capitalism is supposed to be, a role in sacralizing anti-statism, including militant anti-statism, a role as the gateway to libertarianism, and biblical justification for attacks on democracy and human rights. Christian Reconstructionism also overlaps with things like the Ron Paul Revolution, the John Birch Society, whose media was revived in the Tea Party movement, the Neo-Confederate movement, which has its own think tank now. It overlaps with the Mises Institute, a significant hub of libertarianism that is an offshoot from the Koch brothers wing. And we are aware of these old threats, old and continuing threats of racism, misogyny, bigotry. But I think what is less visible and a great concern is how these old resentments are being repackaged in ways that we may not be familiar, how history is being rewritten, how language is taking on new meaning, as well as different challenges, that we've never seen before. Next slide. Which brings me to the last question. What is the end goal? Where are the tracks supposed to take the many different and varied interests that are capitalizing on Dominionist ideas? One of the reasons I use the example of the Green Dragon is it's easy to see how this narrative can be manipulated by people who have nothing to do with the religious right. I mean, it's easy to understand why there would be interest in this country that would want to attack and make environmentalism or acceptance of climate change unholy. Make it holy to attack environmentalism and rejection of climate change. Likewise, with Christian Reconstructionism, which at first glance seems not to have a lot of appeal, if you look at how numerous different interests could be interested in the opportunity to advance their own financial or political agendas on the back of these ideas, then you get a sense of the significance of Christian Reconstructionism and as Dominionism. But while they're scrambling to capitalize on this, I think many of them are probably dismissing or don't even know where these tracks are supposed to lead, which is, for Christian Reconstructionism, a utopian vision of a decentralized libertarian theocracy. My concern is not necessarily that we're going to go this route of this utopian vision of the Christian Reconstructionists. My concern is more that the momentum that this is given to this by those capitalizing on it, the fellow travelers, are going to make the nation ungovernable. But I want to end quickly on a note of optimism. I'm not a political strategist. I'm a researcher with 2 decades invested in this study. I believe there is so much more that we could be doing to counter this movement with a broader and deeper understanding of the interconnected infrastructure of the anti-democratic and theocratic elements of the right. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Woo! If you haven't gotten fired up already, I don't know, you might want to check. Thank you again for your presentation. And there are a number of questions that I think we will field as we wrap up our time together. I want to move to Brother Fred Clarkson, if I could. And let me preface the question I'm going to ask you, Fred, by a memory I have. 1979, I was watching as a young man the flagship show of the Christian Broadcasting Network, the 700 Club. And I watched its leader, who Rachel just showed, Marion Gordon, Pat Robinson, Sr. And he laid out in simple language the plan to take over school board by school board, to take over these school boards across the nation for God, using very clear religious Jesus Christian language. I didn't know at the time those were going to be that was going to be the blueprint for what later became the Christian Coalition. And then leading to Focus on the Family Research Institute, and others of these groups and orgs that are in this theocratizing of this particular frame of thought, both politically and religiously. So in your recent article, Fred, baby, we were born for war, love it. You illuminated the theocratic initiatives like the Truth and Liberty Coalition to target and to take over local school boards. And I would say it goes back even further than that with what Pat laid out, back in the late 70s. What are the dangers of these kinds of initiatives for public education and beyond, reflecting a little bit about the Seven Mountain Dominionism? Could you lay that out just for us a little bit? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Bishop Selders. I remember Pat Robertson having similar kinds of conversations on his show, but also the school board question goes back many decades. I've seen video from local television broadcasts in the early 1960s in Southern California with the John Birch Society trying to take over local school boards in order to oppose sex education. So this is a theme over time. But I think, as we'll see in a moment, this is going to be an urgent matter over the next couple of election cycles. So in general answer to your question, there have been great transformations in evangelical theology over the past half century or so that have made the contemporary Christian right possible, including what we saw in Colorado. In fact, we saw that whole school board thing on vivid display in Colorado. In my recent article, I reported on the empire of Andrew Womack, who's a new kind of televangelist and Christian right educator, kind of in the mode of Pat Robertson. And as he's functioning as a part of a national effort of the Christian political right to make school boards an issue well, they did it in 2021, and they're about to do it again nationally over the next couple of election cycles. Womack built the unaccredited Charis Bible College in Woodland Park, Colorado, along with his own political and broadcast operation, the Truth and Liberty Coalition you mentioned. He founded the latter in 2017. Now, this year, the coalition has held a series of conferences or academies at the college to encourage, recruit, and train candidates seeking local office. One of the coalition's main campaign methods was a 5-question voter guide that favored their apparently handpicked candidates, many of whom won their races in November. The voter guide featured just 5 issues: critical race theory, parental rights, boys playing girls sports, sex education, and gender identity pronouns. The guide, like those pioneered by Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition in the 90s, was intended for distribution in churches on the Sunday before the Tuesday election, as well as distributed online. Now, the implications are clear as the newly elected school board slates that now control boards in several Colorado towns and cities are likely to dilute or end the teaching of sexuality education, American history as it has affected religious and racial minorities, and rolling back advances in trans rights in the public schools. Their campaign may be seen as a pilot project that'll be replicated and expanded in 22 and beyond. Now, this Bible college in Colorado has some 700 students learning how to take what they call the 7 mountains of society in order to achieve conservative Christian dominion along the lines that Rachel was discussing. As you can see in the slide, this is taken directly from the college's website. These are religion, family, education, government, arts and entertainment, media, and business. This approach to theology and politics is now central to much of the Christian right. A part of the genius of this is it means that you don't need a PhD in theology to understand what your mission in life is going to be, and that ministry is no longer just about the clergy, and taking dominion is not just about government. It's about every aspect of society, and there are therefore ministry leadership roles in other areas. Coalition's founders and board include the 7 Mountains mandate theorist Lance Wallnau, along with Dominionist and Christian nationalist author David Barton. So illustrative of the nature of the Charis Bible College program is in practical government. It was originally called the David Barton School of Government. And that's at the website's admissions page proudly declares that the school utilizes materials and prepared by preeminent historian David Barton and other highly esteemed authors. If there's a school for Christian nationalism, this is it. Coalition's weekly broadcast, which is available on a number of cable channels, is almost always deeply political and features Christian right leaders and 7 Mountain theorists. But let's pause for a moment and just consider a bit about how we got here. Some of what I'm about to say overlaps a bit with what Rachel's just explained, particularly the theological changes in the 80s. But I think it's important to really get this because evangelicalism has been transformed. For most of the 20th century, evangelicals were mostly on the political sidelines, not getting in too deep because they did not believe much could be accomplished until Jesus returned. Plus, they thought it was risky to get into the messiness of politics, what they called the things of this world. So politically minded leaders of what would become the Christian right had a hard time leading their people into politics. One writer called this theological schizophrenia. But at the same time, there was a minority led by the theologians of Christian Reconstructionism, notably R.J. Rushdoony, that would eventually help provide an answer. The Reconstructionists advanced the idea that Christians must not only dominate society, but eventually institute and enforce Old Testament biblical law. Now, unlike the doctrines developed within specific denominations, Christian Reconstructionism has been a movement of ideas that transcends and transforms those denominations, has influenced far more people than anyone who ever adopted the label. One of the movement's main contributions has been to provide a biblical rationale for political action for the Christian right, and then also a basis for government and public policy development. Not everyone wholly agrees with Rushdoony, but agree or disagree, his work remains the yardstick by which all Christian right thinkers and leaders generally have to measure where they stand. The Reconstructionists viewed themselves historically as so revolutionary that they've generally avoided the media. But an exception was when Rushdoony agreed to be interviewed by journalist Bill Moyers on PBS in 1987. In the years before the Moyers interview, there had been a series of theological discussions among the theologians of evangelicalism, including Christian Reconstructionists. And perhaps the main takeaway was that the various factions agreed that they could disagree about the timing of the second coming of Jesus. They could also agree to disagree about how much could be accomplished, politically speaking, to change the world in a more conservative Christian direction. But they agreed that it was okay to try. So now at least the door was open to more serious political activism. This transformation was epitomized by the late theologian C. Peter Wagner of Fuller Theological Seminary, who convened various apostles into a loose structure called the New Apostolic Reformation, in which they acknowledged one another, not as a denomination, which they say they oppose, but more as networks of related churches and ministries. And their goal is really to transform all of the institutions of society in this direction. Institutions that are in the way need to be neutralized and crumbled and replaced. Also in the mix during this period was the influential evangelical theologian Francis Schaeffer. His 1981 book, A Christian Manifesto, served as a catalyst for the evangelical anti-abortion movement and the broader Christian right and the creeping theocratization of the Republican Party. Randall Terry, the founder and leader of the militant direct action group that many of us will remember, Operation Rescue, said that you had to read Schaeffer if you wanted to understand Operation Rescue. So what's interesting is that while Schaeffer claimed to support religious pluralism and to oppose theocracy, his work inspired the political activism of many who became full-fledged Dominionists. Schaeffer didn't share Rushdoony's belief that society should eventually be reorganized according to Old Testament biblical laws. But he nonetheless warned of a threat to Christianity by secular government and called for massive resistance, particularly against abortion. This is what inspired Operation Rescue. While Schaeffer called for militant confrontation with the secular state, denouncing judges as black-robed tyrants who are engaged in radical secularization of the public square, promoting homosexuality, and attacking the sacred institution of marriage. But Schaeffer, for all of his militants, also had no particular vision for Christian governance. So if you end abortion, then what? That's why by the 1990s, Operation Rescue leaders were reading Rushdoony and the other Reconstructionists, and Randall Terry himself became a Reconstructionist, often speaking about biblical law. But Schaeffer also contributed an important idea of the Christian right, what he called co-belligerence. And this is the idea that it was necessary, urgent, and possible to set aside theological differences, particularly with the Catholic Church, in order to end abortion and the secularization of society. This principle has grown as the theo-Christian right has matured and gained more power than any of them have thought possible. But Rushdoony and his colleagues' best efforts to lay low notwithstanding, times are changing with regard to popular understanding of dominionism and how it drives our politics. Mississippi Free Press published a major story on Wednesday that reported on dominionism and the anti-abortion movement. Among many other things, they report that in a teaching guide called The Keys to Dominion, authored by anti-abortion activist and New Apostolic Reformation leader Lou Engle and sold on his website, declared that the church's vocation is to rule history with God. We will govern over kings and judges, and they will have to submit. We are called to rule, to change history, to be co-regents with God, according to the teaching guide. Now, as Rachel said, it's necessary to see the whole of what they call the biblical worldview in order to understand what they see as what we may see as issues. Now, they see them as battlefronts in the greater war for the world. So I want to offer just a few quick thoughts about how to proceed, since the Christian right has become the dominant faction in the Republican Party generally, and among Republican members of Congress and state legislators, and the Supreme Court. Roe v. Wade is likely to be overturned, and the Voting Rights Act may not be restored. Rather than trying to contend with all of this at once, I want to stick with just one recommendation for today. And I think that much depends on our sharing basic understandings of our formidable opponents. It's not good enough to broad brush the entirety of the Christian right with hyped up epithets like one that was generated by a political consulting firm in the 1990s. That was religious political extremists. These are simplistic and not descriptive. A large, complex, and successful movement like the Christian right cannot be adequately described, let alone discussed with one term, let alone one that's manufactured for political purposes and that work well in focus groups. What we need is to gain the kinds of knowledge and vocabulary to be able to assess and discuss the tactics and strategy and the strengths and the weaknesses of the Christian right so we can apply those lessons and make adjustments to our own strategy accordingly. Now, the good news here is that getting started could be as simply for all of us as to read a good book about the Christian right as a basis for establishing enough common knowledge and vocabulary to begin to more seriously do this. And for this, I recommend the book by our next panelist, Katherine Stewart, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It's the best current book about the Christian right. And we'll all be so much smarter and better off going forward if we have this book in common. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a little bit smarter listening to both Rachel and Fred as they are sharing the information and their contributions to this conversation. I want to ask Kathy Stewart to join us in this. And in her book, in your book, Kathy, you wrote, sometimes it takes a while to realize what is happening in your own backyard. Recognizing the more visible power games, such as mobilizing conservative pastors, to influence the vote, or back in the day, a few decades ago, they mobilized urban pastors with basketball clinics, to weave in their ideology around marriage and marriage equality, right? So those exist, right? But what are the more covert, more insider power plays that the Christian nationalist movement is playing that many of us don't necessarily recognize or see?
And what a great question. Where to begin? First, I want to thank you and the organizers and my fellow panelists for inviting me to join in this conversation. I always enjoy learning from all of you. Thank you so much to Rachel and Fred for your incredible presentations. I look forward to hearing from Reverend Traci Blackmon. And I want to thank all of you for listening in, for taking time to join us today. I spent last weekend actually observing the Inside Game at the March for Life. It's an annual event in Washington, D.C., and at the National Pro-Life Summit, which was a conference that took place the following day. The crowd's high spirits appeared to reflect their expectation that Roe versus Wade will be kneecapped or overturned in June, which will ban or severely restrict abortion in roughly half the country. And the fight against reproductive rights doesn't stop there. It continues in the States with a particular emphasis, as I could discern from the conversations and speeches at the summit. There's going to be a particular emphasis on bills intended to ban telemedicine and medication abortion, or what they refer to as chemical abortion. In the longer term, these activists are aiming to set a legal stage over time for a constitutional amendment to ban reproductive choice from the moment of conception. And by the way, they describe that as the moment of fertilization and not the moment of implantation, or the time of implantation, which is, as the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, that's how they define a pregnancy, the start of a pregnancy. And this definition that the religious right leaders prefer, it takes aim essentially at some forms of family planning. So speakers at the march and at the conference frequently invoked the struggles for abolitionism and civil rights, apparently oblivious or perhaps willfully oblivious to the fact that the literalist theologians to whom the leadership of the religious right appeal are more directly descended from the pro-slavery theologians of the 19th century and the segregationist theologians of the 20th century. Now, I'm going to return to that point in a little bit, but first I want to tell you about one of the more interesting presentations I heard. There was a seminar on strategy, focusing on strategy at the state level. So from the podium, Christanne Hawkins, who's the president of Students for Life of America, it's a very sort of powerful and dynamic group. She described how anti-abortion groups, along with elements of the movements, the Christian rights voter turnout machine, target Republican politicians who may be themselves nominally anti-abortion. They sort of say they're against abortion, but in the view of this movement leadership, they're insufficiently proactive, and they might hesitate to sort of push the legislative envelope in ever more extreme directions. So if you're wondering why so many of the Republican leaders are being pushed to the right, and why sort of insufficiently, I would say, sort of Republican politicians who the movement sees as, I would say, insufficiently strict and extreme on in this issue, seem to be getting primaried. This is one of the reasons. So in short, the various factions, denominations, and elements of the Christian right are closely coordinating their strategic work. And the strength of that strategic work is really the key to the religious right's power today. The most popular origin story of the movement is that it was born one day in 1973 when the Supreme Court unilaterally shredded Christian morality and somehow made abortion a constitutional right. And the story goes that at that instant, the flock of believers arose in protest and threw their support to the party of life, which it's how they characterize the Republican Party. But this story is false. Christian nationalism drew its inspiration from a set of concerns that long predated the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade. The movement settled on abortion as a litmus test sometime after that 1973 decision for reasons that had more to do with politics than with embryos. And then at that point, it set about changing attitudes of many religious people in the country in order to serve its new political ambitions. So from the beginning, the abortion issue has never just been about abortion. It's always been about dividing and uniting people in order to mobilize votes, not just for abortion, but for political power generally. So let's get into the history of it. When Roe versus Wade was passed, most Republican Protestants supported it. The Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution in 1971 affirming support for abortion law liberalization, and they hailed Roe versus Wade as a sensible, what they saw it as a middle ground. Billy Graham echoed widely shared Protestant sentiments when he said in 1968, he said, in general, I would disagree with the Catholic stance, and he added, I believe in Planned Parenthood. Billy Graham said that. So Daniel K. Williams, he's a professor of history at the University of West Georgia. He pointed out that the early political battles over abortion and state legislatures pitted Catholic anti-abortion lobbyists against Protestant proponents of abortion law liberalization, with most Republican legislators siding with the Protestants. Many Republicans believed that abortion law reform accorded well with the party's tradition of support for birth control, middle-class morality, as they saw it. This is a quote from Daniel K. Williams. It said it accorded well with the party tradition of support for birth control, middle-class morality, and Protestant values. So the most Republican Protestants were actually supportive of choice in some form. Now, the Catholic hierarchy, of course, opposed abortion and had for a long time. But among the populace, at least, the issue did not reliably divide Catholics and Protestants. The historian Leslie J. Reagan has written that many Catholics disagreed with church leadership on the issue, and they shared what she has described as a popular ethic supporting abortion, more tolerant attitudes, often rooted in life experiences. The intense focus on abortion that we see today within the Christian right dates from the start of a political movement that called itself the New Right, whose leaders felt that the Republican Party had become too liberal, too soft on communism. They were very worried about the communist takeover. New Right figures, including Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, Howard Phillips, and Phyllis Schlafly, sought to ignite a hyper-conservative counter-revolution and take the Republican Party off to the right wing. Paul Weyrich had already formulated a strategy that he believed could take this new movement to power. He had studied the successes of the left. This is something the right does. They spend a lot of time studying the left, I would say the left, for lack of a better term, so the moderate liberal left. They spend a lot of time studying the other side, terminology. They're very responsive to sort of cultural developments. So Weyrich was doing this at the time. He was studying the successes of the opposition in the 60s and 70s, and he observed that they had religious allies who helped them advance civil rights and other progressive causes. And progressive theologians, such as Martin Luther King Jr., had used pulpits to mobilize change. Weyrich deduced that if the right could partner with ultra-conservative religious leaders and access a religious vote, they too would be able to access power. So he and his fellows in this new movement drew in ministers like Jerry Falwell, Jim Robison, Pat Robertson, and he urged them to get involved in conservative politics, and so they did. Now, Jerry Falwell, as we know, had no lack of hot button issues to draw on, but the thing that really got him up in the morning, as Weyrich knew, was the threat that the Supreme Court might end tax exemptions for segregated schools. This was a huge issue for many of these religious leaders, these conservative religious leaders who ran segregated, racially segregated schools. They were often referred to as segregation academies. Bob Jones Sr., founder of the college that later became the Bob Jones University, he was an especially ardent segregationist, and he centered his defense of segregation clearly in his interpretation of religion, declaring that God is the author of segregation. He wrote about this often and with a great detail. If anybody's interested, you could look up a really sort of horrible sermon he wrote called "Is Segregation Scriptural?" Is Segregation Scriptural? So he referred to desegregationists as satanic propagandists who are engaged in what he called, quote, communist agitation to overthrow the established order of God. I mean, that frankly sounds very contemporary today when you listen to some of the religious right leaders and how they described the political opposition. Well, but back then, the Internal Revenue Service was starting to look askance at Jones's segregated schools, and they were questioning the justification for its tax-exempt status. So like, why are we funding segregation? It would be hard to overestimate the degree of outrage that this provoked. As far as Bob Jones Sr. and Falwell and others were concerned, they had a God-given right, not just to separate Black Americans and white Americans, but also to receive federal money for the purpose. Emerging leaders in the New Right were really prepared to defend them, and they began to meet regularly and to look for ways to found their new movement, how to give it force and energy. So they got together trying to figure out what kind of message would draw the movement together. The historian Randall Balmer, who has had deep personal connections with the New Right, has written in detail about this in his new book called Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. He describes how leaders got together and basically went down a list of issues. We're talking like 1980 or so. This is like 7 years after Roe versus Wade. So first on the list, of course, was what they saw as the unfair tax treatment of racist academies. They're really upset about that, but they thought, oh, that's not really, stop the tax on segregation isn't really going to be a very appealing rallying cry for our movement. So that was out. And then the women's movement, they were really worried about that too, but there were other issues on the list. But when they came down to abortion, which was not really, at the top of the list, but it was sort of further down, they finally came to the issue of abortion, and it was like a light bulb went off. And they said, wow, that could really work. When Fred spoke in his presentation about co-belligerence, the idea that conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants could find a way to work together, united around some of these issues, that was also very appealing to them. So gradually and over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. Phyllis Schlafly has actually written a very powerful book about that called, I think it's called How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. If anybody's interested, it's really worth reading. It shows that it took a tremendous amount of effort. It was not an easy sell because most Protestant Republicans were actually pro-choice in some form. But today, many conservative-leaning voters have been persuaded that abortion is the single most important issue when it comes to their vote. Leaders know if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So today, when movement leaders talk to the rank and file, when they talk to pastors about turning out their congregations to vote, abortion is key. But when movement leaders are speaking to one another in the forums that they share, and especially when they're talking to their political allies or their very deep-pocketed funders, they advocate for a wide range of policy positions, including the kinds of far-right economic policies that are making it harder for so many American families to succeed. And this again hits home the fact that this is a political movement, and there's a sort of culture war framing sometimes around the religious right, but that framing is really incomplete. This is a broader political movement. Several months ago, I attended a Get Out the Pastors event. It was part of a long-standing pattern in the Christian right and of turning America's networks of conservative churches into a powerful partisan political machine. I attended this event in Virginia, along with 2 or 3 dozen pastors. Chad Connell was part of an initiative called Faith Wins that was focused on church leaders, many of them in swing states, and trying to get them to turn out their congregations to vote the right way. So Chad Connolly, he's a Republican Party veteran and sort of very well-connected member of the sort of the Christian nationalist movement. He said, I've never voted for a pro-death person, who's speaking to all these pastors, I've never voted for a pro-death person, never voted for anybody of any stripe that was okay with killing a baby in a mummy's tummy. I mean, in Christian national circles today, every election is a contest against absolute evil, and the consequences of failure are too dire to imagine. There's absolutely no nuance, no curiosity about political opposition, just a complete, frankly, literal demonization of those who happen to take different positions on political issues. Connolly told the assembled pastors, every church you know needs to do voter registration. Every pastor you know needs to make sure 100% of the people in their pews are voting and voting biblical values. As in most Christian nationalist gatherings, voting biblical values is a transparent euphemism for voting right-wing Republican. Later at that same event, one of the evangelists traveling with Connolly said, the church is not a cruise ship. The church is a battleship. I'm going to end on that note. It's a pretty astonishing thing to say, but this is how many of religious right leaders see they're exploiting religion for political purposes. Yeah, it's not a culture war. This is frankly a political war over the future of democracy. I want to thank all of you for listening, and I look forward to hearing more from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. We're going to turn to Reverend Dr. Blackmon. Listen, it's not beyond us. I think it's the theme in part of all of the other panelists around freedom and rights, and around how Americans today, as they have been historically from before the beginning of this country. So I'm going to lodge it in the United States context, right? And even before the United States. Every movement that has been well organized and well funded, right, moves in a certain kind of way. So today we have these Dominionists, these Christian nationalists, and others whose efforts are centered around, the litmus test of, abortion on one side, right? Or sexual orientation and expression on the other side. Though how those got determined as the linchpin of this now not just religious conversation, but political conversation, right? It's all veiled language and veiled in God and the Bible and all that kind of stuff. This stuff. So here's the question. What's the call for us who are people of faith, people of conscience? What's our call to do better, maybe do different around ensuring true freedom and justice gets experienced by all of us? And then how do we get in the discourse around democracy and what democracy holds for today and tomorrow?
Thank you so much, Bishop Selders. And I want to thank Rachel and Fred and Katherine for those really, really deep and impactful insights into what's happening now. I'm going to speak from a different context, and I hope that people will understand whether you agree or not. As I was listening, I also was reflecting on a conversation that I had some years ago with Archbishop Peter Turkson. I was at the Vatican having some meetings, and in those meetings, I shared with him, just as a passing statement in our conversation, that racism is the original evil of the United States. He stopped me mid-sentence and said, "No, daughter, I think you are wrong. Racism is not the original sin of the United States or anywhere else." He said the original sin of this world is humankind's desire to be God. Humankind's desire to be God. I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of what is happening in this nation right now, because in my opinion, democracy has never existed here. Democracy was birthed prematurely here before there were any efforts to deal with equity, to deal with human value, human worth, outside of a framework that was artificially created around race. And though I know this conversation is about abortion, it's all connected. We can go all the way back to the doctrine of discovery and find the malpractice of theology at play when we wanted to take the land from indigenous people, and the papal document, the doctrine of discovery, interpreted scriptural texts to suggest that people who did not share their culture, their skin tone, their history, were not even worthy of having a soul by God. So what we are seeing now is not new at all. It is a reinventing, a mutation of what has always been at the root of this, and that is the preservation of white supremacy. What we're seeing in this moment is an escalation of all of these things in an effort to maintain a current iteration of a malformed democracy in the midst of a changing demography. And nothing is safe from that, including abortion rights. We don't have to go very far to look at the hypocrisy of that argument by simply saying, what does it mean in this country to be pro-life when it also means that you are not willing to stand up for, vote for, defend the right for people to have health care, for people to have shelter, for people to have a decent and living wage, for people even to be fed. I just watched a whole documentary of pro-life people out on street corners with signs saying adoption is a better option. And as the newscaster went from person to person asking, how many people have you adopted? None of them had adopted any of them. None of them had adopted anybody. So this notion that this is in some kind of, I agree completely that it's a political ploy, but more deeply even than the political ploy is the division of this country that is founded on inequity and not equity. And the bottom line threat of all of this is who is going to rule? Who's going to rule? And nothing is sacred from that. So when I look at what is happening in this country around abortion rights, around voting rights, around marriage equality rights, around health care, around education, when I look at that as a minister of the gospel, I ask myself, what is the role in the church in this? And quite frankly, the role of the church is to tell the truth. And as skilled as conservatives who are leaning towards this quote unquote religious right, I don't like that term, though I know it's the term everyone uses. I don't see the power of definition. There's nothing right about that religion. And there's nothing left about people on the other side. What is central to the gospel is that there is no right or left. There is only the gospel, the truth. And what we are facing in this country at this moment is the manipulation of theology. And that theology is being formed and shaped to serve political, you know what I'm trying to say, circumstances. So what has happened is we have juxtaposed our Christian faith or our Christian identity, as we want to call it, with the American flag. And what does it mean to be Christian in this country is not necessarily to follow an Afro-Semitic Palestinian rabbi named Jesus. That's not what's happening here. It is a form of white Christianity at its very root that allowed for the enslavement of people, that allowed for the dismissal of people, and that allows for the control of the woman's body because it is built on a legacy of supremacy. The Bible at its very core is a message about choice, about bodily autonomy. And I think it is the role of Christian religious leaders to take this. I'm a protester, I'm an activist as well, so I'm gonna say it like this: take it to the streets. The progressive voice has been very hesitant, very shy to call out this for what it is. It is theological malpractice. And the only place that it can get rerouted in terms of the common people of faith is for us to challenge what is being taught in our churches, what has been taught in our schools, as being a malpractice of theology. That's what it is. Just this week, I was invited to speak for a school in Iowa. Doesn't matter what school it is. I agreed to come and talk about the impact of communities to make change. And the day before I was to come, I got a list of requirements that I had to agree to. I had to agree not to use the term white privilege. I had to agree not to use the word supremacy. I had to agree to not speak to any narrative that would suggest that white people were bad. And I don't think white people are bad. I think that this place that we're in has pitted us in a false way. I had to make all of these agreements before I could speak to the children in this high school, because they have adopted this new narrative that is being passed all around critical race theory. I had to agree to stay away from those topics that are seemingly inflammatory. So I had to disagree to show up. And I'm suggesting that in this country, around abortion rights, we need progressive theologians. We need progressive pastors, if that's what you want to call us, to take this on from a theological realm, to rightly divide scripture with an understanding of the equality of women and men in scripture as ordained by God, to rightly divide to rightly dismantle the hierarchy of gender and sex in scripture as ordained by God, and to affirm the right of women to have reproductive health and bodily autonomy and choice over their decisions, no matter how anyone feels about it. We are in a critical moment in this country. It is a moment where democracy, which has always been on life support, is very near death. It's a moment where in Missouri, where I live, we just banned in 2022, Toni Morrison's writings of the Blue Eye. And if we don't wake up, we're going to find ourselves in a place that will be very difficult for us to come back from. So I say it's time to call out the lies. I say it's time to acknowledge that this is not a new way of being. It's just a mutation of what has always been. I suggest that it's time for us to have conversations in these platforms, yes, but not just in these platforms, in the pews of our churches, at the tables of our family dinners. Have the uncomfortable conversations and move away from this place where politics is not something we talk about and religion is not something we talk about, because in actuality, politics is just the way we live our lives. And it is impossible to claim the moniker of Christian identity as it is expressed in the text and not speak out against what we see happening in this country. If you're for the preservation of life, you should be against the death penalty. If you're for the preservation of life, you should be in favor of more people voting and not less people. If you're for the preservation of life, it does not stop at birth. It's from the womb to the tomb. And I think our only salvation will be if those who know better begin to speak up and say better, teach better, preach better, and most of all, do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Blackmon. Thank you all, panelists, for your contributions. We have just a few minutes, and the daunting task is to try to get a couple of questions in here to several of you. And if I could prevail upon you to make, if you want to address whatever the question is with some insights, if you could make it short, again, for those of you who are with us. And I know that's hard for academics, for preachers, and for journalists like yourselves and researchers. So if we could do that, that would be great. We could get a few of these questions in. And again, for those of you who are watching, if you could place into the Q&A section your question. What we're going to try to do is cobble in a couple of these ideas that have been asked in the Q&A and then see what our panelists have to say about it. The very first one, Reverend Blackmon has thrown down the gauntlet around white supremacy. Can somebody else chime in and talk about the emergence of this dominionism, this Christian nationalism, and it's very interesting to me that there are always white men in those conversations, and then they throw a topping of a Black person, typically a man, in those conversations at the very end. Can any of you others other than Reverend Blackmon, can you all chime in around the white supremacy and its usage and its prevalence in this conversation?
I'll jump in quickly.
I was going to say, don't everybody talk at once right there.
So we touched upon a little bit how much the Christian Reconstructionism overlaps with neo-Confederates, with the John Birch Society, with a lot of old things that we know. One of the things I would quickly want to point out about that is it's so important. Yes, I agree. We know what this is. We know this is racism, but it's important for us to look at how this is being repackaged, how they are presenting themselves as the defenders of patriotism and American society and family. And so it's really important. This is what I meant about the old and the new. Yes, this is something old we have known for hundreds of years, but in every generation, in every round, these things become repackaged, presented in a different way. And this is one of the things we've got to get in there and dig in and understand exactly how they are doing that. Most of it is not overt. I mean, we understand in politics, dog whistles and all of these things. So most of it is not overt. And this is something that we need to look at, study, analyze.
Katherine, I saw you getting ready to go to the unmute. You got something you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, there's so much to say. I mean, I want to just point out that, so much to say on this topic. We can talk about the history, we can talk about the legacy of the pro-slavery theologians and how some of that, their ideas and language were cited by and made it into the works of some of the mid-century theologians like Rousas, John Rushdoony. But, I went last summer, I would say early summer, to a Road to Majority conference. It's an annual conference held by Ralph Reed, part of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. It's one of the key strategy gatherings of the religious right. And here's where it gets really complicated. I would say maybe 33 out of 76 or 78 speakers were people of color. Mm-hmm. And Ralph Reed, who's a longtime religious rights strategist, he says, I am pleased to report there are 200 Black pastors and community organizers here with us, and over 500 Latino pastors and community organizers with us here at this conference. And, he was just so excited to sort of offer this presentation of the movement as one that stands for equality. And I think they're very, as I mentioned earlier, they're very responsive to things in the culture. I think they're very sensitive, the movement leaders, to accusations of racism. And so, of course, the movement is, engages in, deep structural racism. They're the ones who are, banning books by writers of color, suppressing the teaching of America's, history of slavery and segregation, racial redlining, all these other factors that have contributed to structural racism in our society. They're the ones who are suppressing votes that disproportionately affect voters of color and others in Democratic leaning districts. And yet they are trying very hard to present a sort of multi-cultural face. And they're also doing some incredibly strategic organizing in, I would say, Latino particular communities in particular. I went to another gathering in Southern California that drew in, I mean, there were like 400 people in this church, largely Latino pastors and their families. And the event was being held by, many sort of leaders in the movement, people like, Jack Hibbs and Rob McCoy, and then a number of sort of very prominent Latino pastors. And they were there to not only, engage these pastors and get them on their side and persuade them of the issues that should matter in election cycles, like abortion, defense of the traditional family and the like, but also engage them in turning out their congregations to vote these biblical values. And there was a kind of incredible irony. There is an incredible irony that, there's this sort of, the movement, it's like the lines between insider and outsider are patrolled with as much fury as ever. This is something that, the sort of movement has done over time. There's like the insiders, the outsiders, the pure, the impure. You're either with us or you're absolutely against us. You're sort of one of the godly group, or you're being controlled by the devil and the enemy. And yet they're trying to sort of shift those lines between insider and outsider, even though they're sort of, very carefully policed. Because I think the movement leaders can see the demographic future as clearly as you or I can. And they know that, they can suppress votes that they don't like. They can claim that an election whose consequences they don't like were stolen, but they're still trying to, siphon the votes that they can. I don't know, this is perhaps a topic for another conversation, but there's just so much to talk about in this area. And I hope that wasn't off topic, but it's just something to keep in mind.
Well, no, it's not off topic at all. Go ahead, Reverend Blackmon.
I'd like to say I agree with what you said, Rachel, and what you said, Katherine. What I am suggesting, though, is, and it's triggering to say white because of where we are in our country. But I want to be clear that I'm not just talking about white skin. I'm really talking about white dominance. It's an ideology. Mm-hmm. And it is not that there aren't Black people who want that same power and that same dominance, or Latinx people or women. We saw that even in the election, looking at the votes. I'm suggesting that it is the dominance, right? Because if we go back and look at the racial history, race is a fabricated social construct, and whiteness kept expanding to do exactly what you're talking about, Katherine, to include more people, because it is the ideology that we're trying to preserve, not the skin, right? For some people, not all people. And so I fully get that. I'm tying that also, though, to reproductive rights, because it's the same ideology of dominance, right? That if we can have this ideology that we are the closest to God, and someone's presentation had a slide about that we are the closest to God. We are the ones who are working in agency with God. And if you think like us, I don't care what color you are, if you think like us, then you are a part of us, and everyone else is on the outside. I'm suggesting that the core undergirding of all of that, no matter how many times it mutates, started with white dominance. And it started, most importantly, I'm saying, it started with a theological document. And we as pastors, our role in this is to go back and examine that theology and deconstruct it, and begin teaching and preaching a theology that reflects the world we want to see.
John Ehrlichman, in a moment of confession, infamous for the Nixon campaign, told the truth. He said, we got to do, this is when Nixon was running for president in '68. He said, we got to do something with the Blacks and with the hippies. So he said, and we can't make the anti-war movement, that's what the hippies were doing. We can't make that, we can't just say they're wrong. And we can't say now that Dr. King done died and now it's being lifted up as a martyr, that being Black is wrong. But we got to somehow find a way to connect them to make what it is that they get invested in criminal. And they use drugs to do it, right? He told us how they set that up. I think what Reverend Blackmon is naming, and several of you also named, that there's something going on here, right? There's something going on here that's not just, oh, why don't we just say this, praise Jesus? No, they have thought this through. They are well tooled, organized, and financed, right? And they are very specific and particular in the way they are raising the stakes of the game. There's one more thing. I know we're right at time, but if we can have one more person comment, there's one other question in the Q&A. And by the way, what we're going to do is we're going to take these questions and in some way respond to them and stay posted on how that happens. So that those who have asked questions, we're going to get to them. I don't know how we're going to do that, but we will. We're going to get to them and speak to them. But I think we need to at least spend just a few more moments with this question. How do we influence those who would claim progressive ideologies, progressive religious tendencies, those of us who espouse, the language of love of the other, et cetera, et cetera? We can wax eloquently when we're in and of ourselves behind closed doors. Again, I think the call that Reverend Blackmon made was to how do we take it to the streets? How do we lift out of our own four walls and four corners of our worlds to in fact engage and wake up? So that's the question. But can we get woke? Can progressives wake up? Go ahead, Katherine.
Okay. I don't want to interrupt anybody. I often think of the words of Ralph Reed, again, the longtime religious right strategist. He said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And this is the thing, like in 2016, George Barna, who's a sort of he's a very well-regarded sort of evangelical pollster, he identified a small number of the most devoted, I'm sorry, I'm going to use the term again, religious right strategists, the most sort of, religious members of the voting public who are the most devoted members of the religious right, and people who don't just vote, they actually get their church members to vote. He said there are only 10% of the population, right? But in 2016, 91% turned out to vote, and 93% of those turned out to vote for Donald Trump. In 2020, the numbers were even higher. I think he said something like 97% turned out to vote. The numbers had gone down to 9%. 97% turned out to vote, 99% voted for Trump. Now, obviously it wasn't enough for Trump to win the election. But what this really shows is that in a country where 40% of people don't turn out to vote, if you have a small cohort voting in disproportionate numbers, you can really dominate in election cycles. And I think that, voting really matters. And the religious right is really good at relational organizing. They do it through churches. They get, congregations to turn out to vote. I think on people who vote in opposition to the politics of conquest and division that the religious right represents don't do as much relational organizing. Many, I would say, moderate or progressive leaning churches often steer clear of politics because they don't want to violate their sort of IRS status. They also, want to be cognizant that they may have politically, congregants with politically diverse leanings. But the religious right doesn't do that. I mean, I think that, doing everything a little more than we did last time really makes a difference. Don't just vote. Get your family and friends to vote. Get people at your church to vote, or your faith community. Get people that talk to them about elections. Make them see past the personality or the quirks of the front runner and look more toward policy. Think about judges, think about the judges they're going to appoint. Just look at the big picture. I think we need to do a better job of persuading people that their vote matters, not just in national elections, but also in, local elections, in state elections. And so I think that, I often think of Ralph Reed. I think, all that matters is who turns out on election day. Really does matter.
So the Restoration of the Voting Rights Act is a part of that, right? Somehow getting a handle on all of these state initiatives to really shrink those who can vote and access to the vote. So Fred, you got something to say, and then we got to go. I know we're over time. I know.
All right, very, very briefly then, just to add on what Katherine was saying. I'm sorry, progressives and prophetic sorts, religious and non-religious. We are so radically set in our ways. We are such status quo thinkers, and we are not meeting the challenge of our time. What Katherine laid out and what Ralph Reed laid out is exactly right. There's a long-term strategy. It's smart, it's mature, it's calculated, and it's working, and we are losing. We have to take a look at, we have to reflect on why that is. Why are we losing? And what are the strengths of the other side that Katherine and the rest of us have laid out? How come they're doing so well? How come they do it so well? How come it's working so well? And I think that if we think ourselves in that evaluative mode, reflect on who we are, where we've been, and where we need to go, in the electoral sense, certainly there are many cultural and values aspects to it and many historical and theological aspects, but they have chosen the game as electoral democracy, and their goal is to erode or to end it as we understand it. And we have to grasp that. There are a lot of pieces to the puzzle for us, to be sure, and we've all talked about some of them, but understand that is the name of the game in our time, whether it's the Voting Rights Act or Roe v. Wade, or many of the state legislative things, mobilizing people. The good news is there are, in fact, more of us than there are of them, as George Barna made and Ralph Reed have made very clear. Figuring out how to expand the we, expand the us, and mobilize in appropriate ways really is the challenge of our time.
Sure do want us to reflect, but I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass. I prayed for 20 years and nothing happened until I started praying with my legs. I think there's an action component. So I love reflection and reading and thinking and praying and being quiet and hearing from God, but we got to do that on the way to the courthouse, on the way to the state house, on our way to the White House, if we will. We got to quit. Thank you for allowing us to talk to you, to share these insights. Could you all do it one more time? Let's give our recognition and our acknowledgement to these panelists who have given us and gifted us such incredible insight. We're coming back to some of this stuff, but can you say amen again, if you will, and applaud these guests and these panelists for us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm glad that I was asked to do this panel, and I'm going to gift it back to the hands of our executive and my friend and my sister in this work, the executive director of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. We call it RCRC. The Reverend Katie Zay. It's in your hands, Reverend Zay.
Very quickly, just echoing the gratitude to all of you. What a rich conversation, an example of the kinds of conversations we love to host at RCRC through the Religion and Repro Learning Center. For everybody who's been on, thank you so much for your time. This has been recorded. It will be uploaded to RCRC's YouTube channel. Please watch, share with your networks. Remember, on the 17th of February, we'll be launching my new book, A Complicated Choice, at 4 p.m. Eastern. And on February 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern, we'll have our next webinar about the massacre generation. We hope to see you all then. Thanks so much. Take care.